In 2025, the McLarens and somehow Max Verstappen fought an incredible championship that went right down to the wire in Abu Dhabi. But what would happen if we excluded Norris, Piastri and Verstappen from all results in 2025? Well, we get an incredible season full of different winners, podium sitters and a great fight for the championship between two drivers who could definitely win one in real life. If given the car, of course. You're not going to want to miss this one. Starting in Australia, we get a George Russell pole to open the season, but he was followed by Yuki Tsunoda in the V-Carb and Alex Albon in third. Through all the chaos and DNFs, we would lose Hadjar on the formation lap, Doohan on lap 1, Sainz under the safety car, Alonso halfway through and Bortoleto and Lawson late on. All of these DNFs were self-inflicted as well. And in the end, it would be Mercedes who won out most as they got a 1-2. Antonelli claims a podium on debut, that's got to be a record of some sort, and Albon gets his first podium since 2020. Stroll gets a good chunk of points, but with his teammate retiring, he can only take Aston Martin to 4th in the Constructors with Mercedes clear out in front and Williams ahead of Ferrari despite having just one scorer. Round 2 at China would see our first of 6 sprints in 2025, and it would be Lewis Hamilton taking his first win in Ferrari colours, with Russell 2nd and Leclerc 3rd. This doesn't change much in the standings, so we'll swiftly move on to the main race. The top 3 on the grid would once again feature George Russell starting on pole, but he was headed by 2 Ferraris. On lap 1, the Ferraris would get away with light contact with each other, but Leclerc would be forced to continue in the race without a bit of his end plate. And somehow, it made him faster as he finished ahead of his teammate in 2nd, with Russell winning again and Hamilton claiming his first real podium for Ferrari. But, this would be cruelly taken away from him as both Ferrari cars and Pierre Gasly would be disqualified. And so let's see what this does to the final result. Well, Russell still wins, but it's now Esteban Ocon in 2nd, with Antonelli claiming another podium and a lot of first time scorers here. Behrman got 10 points in 5th, Sainz finished in 7th, Hadjar was 8th, Lawson was 9th for Red Bull getting their first points of the season, and Jack Doohan got the final point in 10th. We're 2 races in and we've already had 16 different drivers scoring points, which seems like a lot so early on. In the standings, Russell continues to lead out in front, helped by his probable biggest challenger getting 0 points, and Antonelli is currently his closest rival. And in the Constructors, Haas overtake Ferrari and are in 3rd place, with Mercedes establishing an early lead as we fly over to our next race in Japan. The front 3 for this one consisted of Leclerc grabbing his first pole of the season, followed by both Mercedes and Isaac Hadjar, who missed out on a top 3 start thanks to 14 milliseconds. I should also probably mention that Lawson and Tsunoda swapped seats despite the fact that Liam just scored points in China, but whatever. I doubt they'll pull up many trees. This wouldn't be the most interesting of races, and Leclerc would score his first win of the season, with Russell and Antonelli close behind on track. And Albon scores for the 3rd race of the season and now sits in 3rd, behind Leclerc, who has jumped him thanks to getting the big 25 points. And Mercedes have really been on it in the early course of the season, as they have already crossed the 100 point mark, and we still haven't made it out of Asia yet. Ferrari also get back ahead of their customer team and jump Williams at the same time, but they are almost twice as many points behind. I'm liking this qualifying result in Bahrain. Starting on pole for the 3rd time in 2025 would be Russell, followed by Leclerc and Antonelli. But in 4th, missing out by just 3 milliseconds on 3rd, would be Pierre Gasly in that Alpine tractor. What a guy. And in the race, he converted his 4th place into a P4 finish, just like in 2018, with Antonelli dropping down to 8th and Russell winning despite having problems with his telemetry that made it look like he was already on his way to Jeddah. As for the rest of the top 10, Haas get double points, Tsunoda scores again for Red Bull, and Hamilton went from 6th up to 3rd at the checkered flag. In the Constructors, Russell reaches 100 points, but it's now Leclerc in 2nd with Antonelli 1 point behind in 3rd. But thanks to the continued support from their 2nd driver, Mercedes are still 58 points ahead of their closest rivals, and Haas have moved back up to 3rd place, leapfrogging Williams. Jeddah would see Russell on top in qualifying once again, with Leclerc in 2nd and Antonelli in 3rd. But it would not end this way. Leclerc would have the pace and came through to win dominantly, nearly 20 seconds ahead of Russell. George would still finish in 2nd though, and was still ahead of his teammate, meaning the gap shrinks, but barely. Russell is still 36 points ahead of Leclerc, and Antonelli is somewhat in the fight, but I guess Mercedes would never prioritise him over George. And in the Constructors, Mercedes obviously lead, but Ferrari are now in the 100 club and are 54 points behind, having closed the gap down by 4 points. Miami was next, and this was a pretty crazy one. In the sprint, Antonelli would claim pole position 3/10 ahead of his teammate in 2nd and Leclerc in 3rd. But Charles wouldn't be able to start in 3rd because on the way to the grid in the torrential rain, he crashed into the barrier and retired. The race would start in the rain, and Antonelli would keep pole on lap 1, but as the transition to dry started to happen, it would be Hamilton who gambled first. His outlap was strong, and leader Antonelli would come in the following lap. However, before he pulled into his pit garage, a force of otherworldly description told him not to go in the pit box, as bad things were to come for those who chose to pit. Yeah, what am I kidding? Red Bull released Verstappen into him as he came in, forcing him to have to drive another lap around the track. This destroyed any hope he had of winning the race, and Hamilton would take the lead shortly afterwards. While scrapping for 5th place, Lawson and Alonso would collide, and Alonso retired, with Liam earning a 5-second penalty for his troubles. This wouldn't have been a problem normally, but thanks to the race finishing under safety car conditions because of this crash, he dropped to the very back. But he actually didn't drop to the complete back because Albon and Behrman would also get penalties of their own, and so this is how the result looked before penalties get applied, and this is how it looked afterwards. Albon loses a nice 2nd place, Lawson loses his 5th place, and Behrman also misses out on points, with Hülkenberg getting his 1st since the opening race, and Gasly claiming 3 because why not? Here is the driver standings after the sprint, and here is the constructors. Wow, Mercedes are good. Into the main race now, and it wasn't as chaotic as the sprint on Saturday, but Antonelli would claim pole again for Sunday's race, with Russell in 2nd and Sainz in 3rd. But despite once again keeping his lead on lap 1, Antonelli would be hurt by a poorly timed VSC, which benefited his teammate, meaning Russell won, Albon got redemption for Saturday by getting 2nd place, and Antonelli was forced to settle for 3rd. But with Leclerc down in 4th, Russell goes 56 points clear of the Ferrari driver, with Antonelli still breathing down their neck in 3rd. And in the constructors, the gap is up to 75, with Williams having a really good weekend to get up to 90 points and stay in a comfortable 3rd. Travelling across to Europe, we begin in Imola. Qualifying on pole would be George Russell once again, but behind him came Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz, with Leclerc down in 8th and Antonelli in 10th on home soil. I should also mention that Jack Doohan would be replaced at Alpine after Miami by Franco Colapinto, who proceeded to shunt his car immediately in Q1. Into the race, Russell got a blistering start and kept hold of his lead, but later on in the race, DNFs from Ocon and Antonelli in the same place led to 2 different safety car periods that really screwed over Russell. The cars that stayed out long got cheap pit stops under these periods, and with 3 laps to go, Albon was challenging for the win with Leclerc. They will go side by side through Tamburello, but Albon was forced to cut the chicane, and from the embers, through goes Hamilton! Albon had now gone from almost grabbing 1st to falling down to 3rd, but he would have a saving grace, because Leclerc would be deemed to have forced Alex off track and was told to give the position back, which in turn ceded his lead to Hamilton, who would go on to win. Leclerc had just thrown away a win and a potentially big points haul over Russell, who could only manage a P4, but instead they finished next to each other in the standings and he gains 3 points instead of 13. Also, big shout out to Tsunoda, who came from the pit lane to 7th after his monster shunt in qualifying, and send your Fs in the chat to Alonso, who fell from 2nd down to 8th thanks to a terrible Aston Martin strategy. In the standings, Russell is 53 points ahead of Leclerc, and now Hamilton is up to 3rd, finally ahead of Antonelli, who is about to be overtaken by Albon, who has just scored back-to-back 2nd places. And in the constructors, Williams become the 3rd team to break 100 points, and Ferrari actually close up to Mercedes thanks to Antonelli's DNF and Hamilton's win. Russell has been dominating so far in this championship, but Monaco was not the weekend he needed after a mediocre race in Imola. Antonelli would shag the barriers first in Q2, and then Russell's car died on him in the tunnel, retiring him from qualifying also in Q2. And this meant that with no challenge behind, Charles Leclerc would take a dominant pole on his streets, ahead of his teammate in 2nd and Isaac Hadjar in 3rd. However, Hamilton would be given a 3-place grid drop for impeding a certain Red Bull driver who doesn't exist in this universe, and so Hadjar is now starting 2nd in Monaco. And through all the holding up and the dreadful race that unfolded here because of the new mandatory pit stop rules, Leclerc won his 2nd home race in 2 years. Hamilton got back up to 2nd place and Hadjar secured his 1st podium, helped massively by teammate Lawson, who finished a career high 5th. And in this one, Russell would finish in 8th after pulling a move you see on the F1 game and cutting the Nouvelle chicane because he was just bored of being held up. And shout out to Colapinto, who got his 1st points. After missing a golden chance to gain points on Russell last time out, Leclerc didn't let that chance go away this time and is now 32 points behind, having gained 21 points in his rival in this race. Albon is also up to 4th ahead of Antonelli, who didn't score purely because he's had more 2nd places this year. An incredible season for Albon thus far. And check out the constructor standings. Mercedes are now only 8 points in front of Ferrari, and finally we have a fight on our hands. After that big swing in Monaco, Spain would see Russell getting back on top by qualifying on pole, followed by Hamilton and Antonelli and Leclerc in 4th. At the start, Russell made a good start from pole, but he decided to defend down the inside into turn 1, and Hamilton gladly took the lead by going around the outside, with Leclerc getting past Antonelli into 3rd. And then into turn 5, Charles sent it down the inside and took second place. An amazing lap 1 for the Ferrari team means they're now 1-2. Soon after, Leclerc would be making another move as he got past his teammate, taking the lead and pulling a gap on Hamilton. But we jumped to lap 55 of 66 when Antonelli would go off in the gravel with a failure of some sort. At this point, the order was Leclerc still in first, 4 seconds ahead of Russell, and then Hamilton in third. But with Antonelli gone, there was a big 4th place up for grabs, being contested by Hadjar, Hülkenberg and Gasly. But then, with 2 laps to go, instead of just settling for 4th, Hülkenberg actually had the pace to get past Hamilton, and so, on lap 65, the Hulk moved up into the podium places, and that is how it would end. I don't know how Hamilton went from leading this race to ending up finishing behind Hülkenberg, but I'm not complaining. Here is the final result, and my god does it look good. But what this does to the standings is not much. Leclerc does gain on Russell for the 3rd weekend in a row, but he's still 25 points behind. However, in the Constructors, Ferrari overtake Mercedes for the first time, now 11 points ahead of their closest rivals. Canada would be a great weekend for Mercedes and George Russell. He would take pole 5 tenths ahead of his teammate with Hamilton in 3rd and Leclerc down in 5th. The race would see Russell get off the line well and keep his lead, and he never let it go. Before a late safety car caused by... yeah, Russell was 5 seconds ahead of his teammate and 24 ahead of Leclerc. With Hamilton just behind his teammate in 4th, this means Russell is now 35 points ahead of Charles, with Mercedes going back ahead by 5 points. Moving on to Austria, Leclerc would respond, putting in a brilliant final lap to take pole ahead of his teammate in 2nd and almost 3 tenths ahead of Russell. That's massive in Austria. And this would translate into the race. Although Russell would get past Hamilton into turn 1, he ended the first lap back ahead of the Mercedes. However, Antonelli would get revenge on a certain someone at turn 3 and retired, leaving Russell without his teammate for the rest of the race. And it would end with Leclerc converting his pole into a win, Hamilton finishing up in 2nd and Russell coming 3rd, 43 seconds behind Leclerc. With this result, the gap drops down to 25 once again as Hamilton is slowly coming into contention as Antonelli is kind of faltering. And only having one driver scoring is really hurting Mercedes as Ferrari retakes top spot again and are 23 points ahead going into Britain. The first wet race of the season came out, of course, the British Grand Prix. But on Saturday it was dry and Russell managed to edge past Hamilton to take pole, with Leclerc not too far away in 3rd. The top 3 was separated by 92 milliseconds. But on Sunday it would be Hamilton lining up on pole because Russell and Leclerc would gamble for dry tyres on the formation lap. Now this was risky because while it wasn't raining at the start of the race and the track wasn't that wet, it was supposed to start raining early on into the race. As the grid got the crashing out of the way on lap 1 and Bortoleto spun on an invisible banana peel, we got an early VSC which Stroll used to get some soft tyres on before it started raining. And not too long after that, it started raining hard. By this time he'd swapped back onto the Inters, but he'd gained time and places considering he started 14th. And so, when the rest of the grid came into pit for their new Inters, Lance Stroll became our new race leader, followed by Nico Hülkenberg and Pierre Gasly. If you like the look of that top 3, trust me, I do as well, stay tuned for my F1.5 video I'm doing soon. There will be a lot more top 3s that sound and look like that. But getting back to this race, with Leclerc and Russell hurt by their opening lap gamble, one of these guys is probably going to win the race. But behind, Lewis Hamilton was coming through and he was making it look easy. Just look at this double overtake into turn 3. On lap 30, he closed up to Gasly for 3rd place, and as Pierre got all out of shape in Stowe, Lewis sent it down the inside of the next corner to get onto the podium. But ever since he slotted in behind Stroll, Hülkenberg had stayed close, about a second or 2 behind. And as we approached 2/3 distance, Stroll's tyres were really struggling, and the Hulk had a run down Hanger Straight. And on lap 35, we had a new race leader, Nico Hülkenberg. But things would not get better for Stroll as Hamilton was soon past him, looking to get a massive home victory that could potentially ignite his title charge. But after overtaking Stroll, Lewis didn't close up to Nico, keeping about a 2-second gap to the car in front. And even through the transition back to dries, Sauber nailed their pit stop and Nico kept it cool, staying out in front. So as our championship leader floundered in the lower points positions and his closest rival was out of them entirely, Nico Hülkenberg would come out of the final corner still leading and won the 2025 British Grand Prix. He held off the home favourite, but this was an incredible result for F1. He just got his first podium a few races back and now he's a race winner. From 16th on the grid as well. On the podium would also be Pierre Gasly as the Aston Martin was terrible at keeping its tyres in shape and Stroll's great drive only left him in 4th place. But in our championship, Leclerc doesn't score any points, and so Russell re-establishes a 30+ point lead, with Hamilton only 25 points away from his teammate and Albon closing in on Antonelli for 4th place again. Hulkenberg also jumps from 9th up to 6th thanks to him getting 25 points. And in the Constructors, Ferrari extend their lead as Antonelli had a rough race, getting rear-ended by Hadjar halfway through and retiring as a result. Mercedes are now 35 points behind their rivals, as behind Williams at least, it's really heating up. Following this crazy result in Britain, we would have a sprint in Belgium, and this was a very weird result. Well, Hamilton would be knocked out in SQ1 along with Antonelli, but then Russell would get knocked out in SQ2 as Leclerc took pole from Ocon and Sainz. And that's how the race would finish, with Russell unable to make much progress. As a result, Leclerc closes up to within 23 points of his rival, and Ferrari get 8 more points on Mercedes. Into the main race, we had a more normal looking grid. Leclerc would be on pole again, but Russell would be in 3rd, split by a wild Alex Albon, with Antonelli and Hamilton both getting knocked out in Q1 again. So much for his title charge. On race day, it was wet, and we would get a rolling start because of the insane spray. Because of this, everyone would keep position, but Russell got past Albon not long after. From here on out, it was pretty boring, and Leclerc would secure the victory, with Russell staying in 2nd and Albon rounding off the podium. Hamilton would do a great job to recover to 4th, and this is how our standings look. Russell is now only 16 points ahead of Leclerc, and Albon is back ahead of Antonelli, who has really fallen off in the middle part of the season. And in the Constructors, Ferrari are making the most of Antonelli's form, as they are now 62 points ahead of Mercedes. Remember when it was Mercedes that were miles clear? Hungary was definitely an interesting one, but as Leclerc took a hard-fought pole, he would be followed by Russell and then the Aston Martins in 3rd and 4th. Off the line, the order stayed mostly the same, but Bortoleto did move up into a very nice 4th place. We would stay in this order until late on in the race. Ferrari had messed up their strategy in typical fashion, so much that we got this insanely long radio message, and after dominating most of the race, Leclerc was now under pressure from who else than George Russell. It all came to a head on lap 62, as when Russell went for a late move into turn 1, Leclerc responded with an even later defensive move that lost him the lead of the race and gave him an additional 5-second penalty. So Russell won the race, followed by Leclerc and then Alonso, who secured the podium, and means the gap in the standings rises back to 23 between Russell and Leclerc. And the gap in the Constructors is still pretty big, but Mercedes did outscore Ferrari by 11 points. Zandvoort had a very strange result for us, because starting on pole wouldn't be Leclerc, it wouldn't be Russell, but instead rookie Isaac Hadjar, who pulled out an incredible lap in Q3 and secured P1 for the race by 47 milliseconds. However, he did have the championship leaders right behind him in 2nd and 3rd. On lap 1, he held onto his pole as Leclerc got past Russell behind him. On lap 23, Hamilton would chuck it in the barriers, which brought out a safety car that really screwed over Leclerc. This meant that he dropped behind Russell and would need to overtake him again, and so he pulled out one of the best overtakes of the year. After the second DRS straight, he would send one around the outside of Russell, and after being left no room, went off the track, crashed into George a little bit, and then deservedly kept the place. We need more of this, the racing is very bad at the moment. So he got past Russell, which at least reduces the gap in the standings, but Ferrari had other ideas. Later on in the race, they got spooked by an Antonelli pit stop and so brought Leclerc in despite him showing good pace, and then Kimi took him out at turn 3. Maybe this was the operation everyone has been talking about, because this result is about to really benefit Russell. But with this safety car, Russell had another chance to take P1 off of Hadjar, who hadn't made a single mistake up to this point. However, through this restart and the next one caused by someone who we can't talk about, Hadjar kept his lead, and come lap 72, he was still leading, and as a result, takes his first Grand Prix win. He had gotten a podium back in Monaco, but this was an exceptional drive from the rookie. With this massive result, Hadjar is almost at the 100 point mark and is only 21 points behind Antonelli, which would be truly something. But obviously there's been a big swing at the front because Russell is now 41 points ahead of Leclerc and Mercedes are starting to pull that Ferrari lead back. The gap is now just 33 points, so they're doing a decent job. Italy next, and as is customary, Leclerc performed when it mattered most and got pole ahead of his teammate who would take a grid penalty and ahead of Russell who would end up starting 3rd. And on race day, he held onto his lead on lap 1 and never gave it up. Russell kept his 2nd place though, which wasn't the best news for Charles, but at least he's gaining points. The gap is now at 34 points and Hamilton becomes the 3rd driver to break 200 points. On the same weekend, Russell became the 1st to hit 300. Ferrari's 1-3 does help them out in the Constructors as they extend their lead from 33 to 47 heading into Baku, and Williams reached 200 points as they have held on to their 3rd place since the very start. Baku was a very strange weekend. Wind was catching out a lot of the drivers all weekend, and in qualifying it took Leclerc as he crashed in Q3 and would be forced to start in P7. In front of him were the usual suspects, Russell, Antonelli, but the top three would consist of Carlos Sainz on pole, Liam Lawson in second, and Kimi Antonelli in third. In the race, Carlos held onto his pole in the early stages, but Mercedes worked a brilliant strategy by starting Russell on the hards and going longer, and that is how he took the win from Carlos. Behind, Antonelli also jumped Lawson in the pit stops, but the latter would perform admirably in defending from Tsunoda to keep his 4th place. And as for the Ferraris, they would not have a very good race, finishing 6th and 7th. A 34-point deficit has now become 53, and Mercedes have brought it back again in the constructors as they sit just 21 points behind Ferrari. Moving into Singapore, we are kind of at a breaking point. Another Ferrari disaster class weekend and Leclerc is pretty much out of the fight. So when Q3 ended and Russell was on pole, that was probably not a nice feeling for Leclerc in P4. The race went just about as you'd expect. Ferrari did not go well in Singapore and Hamilton was lucky to finish at all, considering his brakes failed with a few laps to go. As for Russell, he utterly dominated, and Antonelli did well to secure the 2nd place, meaning George is now 63 points ahead of Leclerc. Ironic. And Mercedes are just 3 points behind Ferrari in the standings. If this Drivers' Championship continues to get more distant, at least we have the constructors to fall back on. But that's the European times Asian leg done, now let's move to the American bit. Kota had another sprint in store for us, and starting on pole would be Nico Hülkenberg, followed by Russell and Alonso. But at turn 1, Alonso and Hülkenberg crashed into each other and Russell came through to take the lead. Finishing behind him was Sainz and then Hamilton as Leclerc was down in 4th. The gap has now risen to 66 points in the driver's standings and Ferrari actually gained a point on Mercedes in the constructors. Into the main race, and it would be Leclerc who had the upper hand, taking a marginal pole from Russell and his teammate in 3rd. At turn 1 there was no incidents and Ferrari were actually pretty decent in Austin, so it ended with Leclerc winning, Hamilton coming home in 2nd and Russell finishing 3rd. This doesn't do much for Leclerc's title bid, but a 56-point gap isn't horrendous. As for the constructors, Ferrari pick a great time to grab maximum points as they are now 31 points ahead of Mercedes as we head across the border to Mexico. Leclerc kept up the momentum from Kota and took yet another pole, but he can't get away from Russell who was right behind him in 2nd. At turn 1 he kept his lead in contentious fashion, but he held the lead as behind him it all kicked off. Hamilton would get into a battle with someone we can't mention, and as this progressed, Behrman popped up out of nowhere to claim what was at the time P3. But with Hamilton deemed to have gained a lasting advantage, he was given a 10-second penalty that gave Behrman a provisional P2. As the race progressed, Leclerc was untouchable and Russell and Mercedes weren't the fastest as they couldn't even overtake the Haas driver, and so it ended with Leclerc winning by 10 seconds to Behrman and then Antonelli. Russell still finished in 4th, which wasn't too bad, but Leclerc now had the momentum and goes into Brazil and another sprint weekend 43 points behind Russell. Could this be the start of a great comeback? In the constructors, at least Ferrari are keeping it consistent as they now have 29 points in hand over Mercedes. As I said before, Brazil was a sprint weekend and Antonelli fancied taking over another sprint weekend. He would claim pole on Friday, scoring a lights to flag victory on Saturday as Russell was 2nd and Leclerc was 3rd. We can move on pretty quickly as nothing really changes here. For the main race, Antonelli would get pole again with Leclerc in 2nd, Hadjar in 3rd and Russell in 4th. At the race start, he would keep the lead and would continue to lead until Bortoleto crashed into Stroll and Hamilton crashed into the back of Colapinto on a straight. This brought out a safety car and on the restart, a certain caused a crash which launched Antonelli's car into Leclerc's, and unfortunately for him, he was forced to retire, having suffered big suspension damage. From here on out, Antonelli drove a flawless race to take his first win in F1, followed home by his teammate and Ollie Behrman, who is having a great run at the moment. But the standings look bleak, I have to say. With 3 rounds and a sprint remaining, Russell is up by 62 points and it's going to take a lot now to salvage this for Leclerc. And as for the constructors, the Mercedes 1-2 and the double Ferrari DNF means Mercedes are back in front, now leading the Italian team by 19 points. But at least Vegas is next. That's always a good race, right? Well, we got a surprising pole, that's for sure. Carlos Sainz would take pole ahead of Russell and then Liam Lawson in 3rd. All this while Leclerc was down in 6th. At turn 1, Sainz would take the wrong line and Russell would pounce on that chance, and behind them, Leclerc was forced to take avoiding action, meaning he didn't gain many places, if any. As Russell started to check out in front, Leclerc knew he had to save something, and so he got to making overtakes. He got one free position when Lawson's front wing failed, he dive bombed Behrman at the end of the strip, he did the same to Hadjar a few laps later, and as the pit stop window opened, he managed to successfully overcut Sainz. However, Mercedes had a secret weapon for protecting George, Kimi Antonelli. He had pitted on like lap 2 for hard and had extended them for over half the race, and somehow he managed to keep Leclerc behind on fresher tyres and protected his teammate from Charles getting any closer. Yeah, he had a 5-second penalty, but at least he prevented Leclerc from getting close to Russell.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say.
So yeah, I think Antonelli might have driven a masterclass here. He keeps his second place despite getting a penalty, and Leclerc is forced to settle for third. And so, thanks to this, the gap is now 72 points from Russell to Leclerc, and we can now crown George Russell as our new champion. With only 58 points left up for grabs, it's mathematically impossible now. However, Ferrari still have a chance to grab the constructors as they are 41 points behind. Qatar was going to need to be big for them, but Qatar was not very good for them. In the sprint, Russell and Antonelli scored points while Ferrari were nowhere to be seen, and in the race, Sainz would win from Antonelli and Russell in third, and that means that Mercedes clinched the constructors with a race to spare. Here's the final standings after Abu Dhabi, and stay tuned for what I've got coming on in the next few weeks. But for now, check out what happened when I disqualified last place from the championship in the historic 2012 season.